He had stood before kings and never flinched. He had buried his father at 19 and carried the weight of a dukedom like a second skeleton beneath his skin. But nothing, not the wars, not the debts, not the cold-eyed creditors who had circled the Blackthorn name like starved wolves, had ever made Adrian feel the particular kind of sick that came from watching Serena Vale walk out of a room she would never enter again. She didn't slam the door. She didn't weep or throw accusations like crockery. She simply turned and left, and the silence she left behind was the loudest thing he'd ever heard. If you want to understand what kind of man throws away the only person who ever truly held him together, stay. Because this story doesn't spare him, and it shouldn't spare you either. The announcement had been made on a Thursday. Adrian remembered that detail with the kind of precision a man reserves for things he cannot unknow. The day of the week, the weight of the air in Blackthorn Hall's receiving room, the particular amber quality of the afternoon light that fell through the tall windows and painted the Persian rug in tones that looked, later, like old blood. Thursday, the 14th of March. He had chosen Thursday because Vivian said Thursdays were auspicious. He hadn't questioned it. That alone should have told him something. The engagement notice went to 3 papers simultaneously. His solicitor, Mr. Hadfield, had coordinated the timing with the efficiency of a military campaign, and by Friday morning, the name Vivian Ashcroft was being paired with the Blackthorn dukedom in every drawing room in Mayfair. Society, that great gasping creature of appetite and opinion, had devoured the news with the enthusiasm of the genuinely starved. Adrian was 31, one of the wealthiest men in England, and had remained unmarried long enough that speculation about him had become a minor London industry. That he had finally chosen Vivian Ashcroft, of all women, with her dark hair and her luminous social architecture and her talent for making every room feel like it had been arranged specifically for her entrance. This was the kind of event that warranted the best china. He had not told Serena himself. That fact lived in him now like a splinter he kept forgetting about until he moved wrong. He had meant to. He had constructed the conversation in his head a dozen times, had imagined her quiet face arranging itself around the news, had even, in some buried corner of his reasoning, expected her to, what? Understand? She was always understanding. That was part of the problem, or what he had told himself was the problem. Serena Vale understood everything and demanded nothing, and had never once in 4 years made him feel the particular guilty discomfort of being seen too clearly. Which was why, when Thursday came, he had sent Hadfield instead. A brief note. Formal language. The kind of language that put distance between the words and the man who'd written them. He hadn't watched her read it. He'd told himself there was no reason to. She came to Blackthorn Hall on the Saturday, 2 days after the announcement, and she came alone. Adrian was in the East Study when Pemberton, his head of household, knocked twice and entered with the particular expression he reserved for situations requiring diplomacy. "Miss Vale is in the entrance hall, Your Grace. She asked if you had a moment." Adrian set down the correspondence he'd been holding without reading. Outside, the March wind was moving through the old elms along the drive, and he could hear them from where he sat. That low, organic sound like the house itself breathing. "Send her in," he said. He didn't stand when she entered. He noted that now, years later, with the clean disgust of a man reviewing his own behavior from a sufficient distance to finally see it accurately. He sat behind the desk like a man receiving a tenant, not someone who had sat beside him at his father's deathbed, not someone who had managed 3 of his household accounts for 2 years without ever once being asked, not someone who had, on a cold November night 14 months ago, told him the truth about his brother's gambling debts before the scandal could reach anyone else, told him quietly, without drama, because she'd seen the documents and known he needed to know before the wrong people did. He sat. She stood. Serena Vale was not the kind of woman who stopped a room. She was medium height, with dark auburn hair she wore simply, and gray eyes that were her most striking feature. Not because they were conventionally beautiful, but because they had a quality of stillness in them that most people found either calming or unsettling depending on their conscience. She dressed well, but without ostentation. She was, in the language of London society, the kind of woman one tended to overlook until one suddenly couldn't, and by then it was usually too late to fully account for how much territory she'd quietly occupied. She stood in the doorway of the east study in a dark green wool dress, and she looked at him, and she said nothing for a moment. "Serena," he said. He heard how formal it came out. He didn't correct it. "I wanted to congratulate you," she said, "in person." That wasn't necessary. "No," she agreed. It wasn't. There was a quality to her stillness that he found, in that moment, mildly irritating. He had expected, again, that word, he had expected something. Tears, perhaps, or the kind of controlled brightness women use to mask their pain, that particular social performance he'd witnessed at enough dinner parties to recognize on sight. He had braced for it. Serena gave him neither. She stood in the doorway of his east study and looked at him the way one looks at a piece of furniture that has been moved to the wrong room, and her expression said, with no words at all, "I see exactly what you did, and I see exactly why, and I am not going to perform grief for your comfort." "How did you hear?" he asked. The words sounded foolish the moment they were out. He knew how she'd heard. Hadfield's note. He'd sent it himself. "Mr. Hadfield's note was very thorough," she said. "Very professional." He said nothing. "Vivian must be pleased," Serena said. Her voice was entirely even. "She's wanted this for some time." Something shifted in his chest. Not guilt, or not purely guilt. More the sensation of having stepped on ground he'd thought was solid, and finding it gave slightly underfoot. Vivian and Serena were step-sisters. He had not, in his architecture of justification over the past weeks, spent significant time with that particular fact. He spent time with it now, briefly, in the 2 seconds between her words and his response, and found the whole thing uncomfortable in a way he chose not to examine. "You and Vivian have always had a complicated relationship," he said. "Yes," she said. "We have." She moved then, not toward him but to the window on the east wall, the one that looked out over the kitchen garden, bare and frost-browned at this time of year. She looked out at it for a moment, and he watched her profile in the gray March light, and he was struck, suddenly and inconveniently, by the thought that he could not actually recall the last time he had looked at her, not glanced, not registered her presence. Looked. "I won't keep you," she said, still facing the window. "I imagine you have a great deal to arrange." "Serena, don't." The word was quiet, but it stopped him. She turned from the window. "Please don't say whatever you were about to say, Adrian. I've been thinking about what I wanted to say to you for 2 days, and I've decided I'm not going to say most of it. Because most of it doesn't matter anymore, and the parts that do matter, you already know." He stood then, finally. Old reflex. Something about the quality of her voice pulled at the basic social mechanics of him, the ones his mother had drilled in deep enough that they functioned even when he wasn't thinking. He stood behind the desk, and the distance between them felt oddly vast. "You could have told me yourself," she said. "Not an accusation, a fact. The kind of fact that doesn't need ornament." "I know." "You chose not to." "Yes." She looked at him for a long moment. "Why?" He opened his mouth and closed it. The honest answer was available to him, sitting right there at the surface of his reasoning where it had been for weeks. Because it was easier. Because Serena understanding things made them real in a way that was sometimes intolerable. Because she would have listened without flinching and said something measured and clear-eyed, and he would have had to sit in the room with that, with her, with the fact of what he was doing and why. And he hadn't wanted to. He didn't say any of that. "It seemed cleaner," he said, "through official channels." Something moved through her expression. Not quite pain, not quite contempt. Something that lived between them. She nodded slowly, as if he had confirmed something she had been half hoping he would disprove. "Official channels," she repeated. "Of course." She picked up her gloves from where she'd set them on the side table near the door. She pulled them on with the neat, habitual precision of a woman who had been dressing herself without assistance her entire adult life, and Adrian stood behind his desk and watched her and felt, for the first time, the particular gravity of what he was watching. Something ending, something that had been, he was only now beginning to understand, quite large. "I won't come back after today," she said. She said it simply, without theater. "I think that's best for everyone. Serena." Is there anything you actually need from me? She looked at him directly. Anything I've been managing that you'd like me to brief someone on before I go? The Tennyson correspondence is still open. The Haverfield matter. Mr. Pemberton knows the broad strokes, but not the detail. I can write it all down if you'd like. Mus. Something in the offering, the sheer, unadorned practicality of it, the fact that she was standing in front of him 4 years of quiet devotion later and asking if he needed her to document her own replacement, hit him in a place below his ribs that he hadn't known was unguarded. No, he said. No. I'll manage. She nodded again. Good. She walked to the door. She put her hand on the frame. She paused, and for a moment, one specific, unbearable moment, he thought she was going to turn. He thought she was going to say something that would crack the studied composure of the last 20 minutes, something that would make this feel like what it actually was, instead of what he was pretending it was. She didn't turn. Take care of yourself, Adrian, she said. And then she walked out, and the sound of her footsteps moved down the corridor, and the front door of Blackthorn Hall opened and closed, and she was gone. He stood behind his desk for a long time after. The elms moved in the wind outside. He picked up the correspondence he'd been holding and read the same paragraph 3 times without absorbing a single word. And the engagement proceeded with the smooth momentum of a well-funded production. Vivian Ashcroft was everything that London required of a future duchess. She had presence, genuine architectural presence, the kind that rearranged rooms by entering them. She was intelligent in the way that society rewarded, quick, selective, always oriented toward what would be useful. She laughed at the right moments and maintained silence at the right moments, and had an instinct for social danger that Adrian privately respected, even as he was beginning to notice, in the slow, accumulating way one notices things one doesn't want to notice, that her instincts were entirely self-directed. Every calculation Vivian made landed, eventually, on Vivian. It was elegant, really, like watching a very precise machine whose sole function was its own advancement. He told himself this was fine, this was practical. He did not need a woman who loved him. He needed an alliance, a household manager, an heir, a name beside his that would cement rather than complicate his position. He was a duke. His feelings were not the primary variable. Vivian moved through the spring season at his side with the assurance of a woman who had always expected to occupy exactly this space, and London adored her, and the papers were effusive, and his mother, dead 3 years but still present in the particular way that formidable women remain present, would have had specific opinions that he was glad he would never have to hear. He did not think about Serena, or rather, he thought about her at specific, inconvenient moments, and then redirected. He was good at redirecting. It was a skill you developed, running an estate the size of a minor county, the ability to move from the thing that demanded your attention emotionally to the thing that demanded your attention operationally, and to let the distance between them grow until it felt like a fact of geography rather than a choice. The Haverfield matter, he discovered 6 weeks after her departure, was more complicated than he'd understood. There were letters, a series of them apparently, between Lord Haverfield and a man named Crowley, who managed investment accounts for 3 of Adrian's subsidiary holdings. Pemberton brought the folder to him with the expression of a man delivering something unpleasant and being sorry about it. "I found these in the correspondence room," Pemberton said. "Miss Vale had flagged them. There's a note in her hand at the front." Adrian opened the folder. Serena's writing was small and precise and characteristically unadorned. The note read, "Potential financial exposure. Crowley's relationship with Haverfield predates the Darwell contract by 8 months. I haven't confirmed the connection yet, but the timing is wrong. We'll continue monitoring. SV." He stared at the note for some time. He went back through the letters. They were damning enough that the slowness of his comprehension embarrassed him. A man in his position, with his experience, and he had not seen this. He had looked at Crowley and seen an efficient manager of accounts, and had never once questioned what else the man might be efficient at. "When did she flag this?" he asked Pemberton. "The note is dated February, Your Grace." February. A month before he'd sent Hadfield with his professional, thorough note, while she'd been, What? While she had apparently been sitting with evidence of active financial manipulation involving one of his most trusted external contractors and had not told him. No, that wasn't right. She had been monitoring it. She had been preparing to tell him once she had something conclusive, because that was how Serena operated. She didn't alarm people with half information. She gathered it until it was solid, and then she presented it cleanly so that the person receiving it could act. And then he'd sent her away. He sat with the folder in his lap for a long time. The Crowley matter, once he began pulling at it properly, took 2 weeks to unravel. It was careful work. He had Hadfield assist him, kept it contained, moved through the financial records with the deliberate attention of a man who has just realized he's been walking through a room with a glass floor. What he found was not catastrophic, not yet, but it had the architecture of something designed to become catastrophic at a chosen moment. Funds rerouted through intermediary accounts. Documentation that would read one way in normal review and quite differently if you knew where to look. Crowley, when Adrian had him in for what was presented as a routine meeting and was not, lasted approximately 12 minutes before the careful construction of his explanations began to develop visible structural problems. He was dismissed that afternoon. Quietly. The kind of quiet that is louder than shouting in certain circles. Adrian dealt with it. He managed the consequence. But sitting in his study afterward with the documentation laid out across his desk, he found himself calculating, not the financial exposure, not the legal implications, not the political fallout. He was calculating time. How long Serena had been watching this. How long she had been carrying that knowledge and managing the edges of it while also managing the Tennyson correspondence and whatever else she'd been quietly attending to that he'd never fully cataloged because it had simply always been done. He was calculating what it would have cost her and what she'd received in return. The answers were not comfortable. Odd. The summer was social and relentless in the way English summers could be when you occupied a position that required your presence at every significant gathering. Vivienne was excellent at all of it. She moved through dinners and country weekends and charity galas with the total competence of a woman who had been preparing for exactly this role since adolescence, and Adrian watched her and thought about efficiency, and about what efficiency actually meant when it was the only thing. He had begun, somewhere in the months since Serena's departure, to notice an absence where he hadn't expected one. Not the obvious absence, not Serena's presence, exactly, or not just that. More specifically, the absence of being known, of having someone in a room who was watching the same things he was watching and drawing similar conclusions. Vivienne was observant, but her observations landed in service of Vivienne. He had no one who was simply watching the same room and might afterwards say, "Did you notice Alderton's expression when Hartley mentioned the Northern contracts? Because I noticed it." He told himself this was sentimentality. He told himself competent men did not organize their emotional architecture around the loss of a secretary. The word landed wrong every time he applied it. Serena hadn't been his secretary. She'd never been assigned that role, had never been paid for it, had never been asked to do half of what she'd apparently done. She had been, the daughter of an old family connection, a woman who had occupied a peripheral position in his social orbit that had gradually, over 4 years, become something he didn't have a clean word for. Not because the words didn't exist, because he hadn't been paying enough attention to apply them. In September, his political contacts in the North began reporting problems. Old alliances that had been steady for years were showing unusual instability. A lord who owed him significant political support on a pending land matter was suddenly unavailable for meetings. A second man, one Adrian had considered entirely secure in his camp, had made comments at a dinner in Edinburgh that reached Adrian third hand and made no sense, until, sitting with the information at 2 a.m. in his study, he began to see the shape of what had been happening and when it had started and understood, with a cold clarity that had nothing to do with the temperature in the room, that this had not started recently. This had started while Serena was still here, and she had seen it. He was certain, suddenly and completely, that she had seen it, the way she'd seen Crowley, the way she'd apparently seen things he was only now stumbling over in the dark. He had a letter drafted to her 3 separate times. The first was too formal. The second was too much the other direction, embarrassing in its candor, the kind of letter you wrote at midnight and burned in the morning. The third was practical, brief, oriented entirely toward the specific issues he needed her perspective on, and he looked at it for a long time before putting it away. She was gone. She'd made that clear. She had told him, in the quiet and unambiguous language that was her particular register, that she would not come back, and Serena Vale was not a woman who made statements she didn't intend to keep. He had made his choices. The consequences were his. The news came in November. Hadfield brought it to him, which told him before a word was spoken that it was something significant. Hadfield was a composed man, unflappable in the particular way of long-serving solicitors who had seen too much human catastrophe to be reliably surprised by any new instance of it. He came into the East Study, always the East Study, for the things that mattered, with his briefcase and his expression of contained distress, and he sat in the chair Adrian indicated, and he placed his hands flat on his knees, and he said, "Your Grace, I have received some difficult news regarding Miss Vale." The quality of stillness that came over Adrian in that moment was the kind that happens before the body fully processes what the mind has already understood. "What news?" he said. "She left England in August," Hadfield said. "I have only just learned this. She was not. She did not leave forwarding information with anyone I had contact with. She traveled to the continent and then, as I understand it, took a sea passage." He paused. "The vessel encountered significant weather in the Bay of Biscay in late September. There were survivors. Miss Vale was not among them." The sentence landed in the room and stayed there. Adrian was aware of specific details. The fire in the grate, the pile of correspondence on his desk, the sound of rain beginning against the east window. He was aware of these things with the particular hyperclarity that the mind sometimes provides in moments it cannot otherwise process. "You're certain," he said. "The consulate has confirmed it. I'm deeply sorry, Your Grace." He sat in the chair behind his desk for some time after Hadfield left. The fire burned down. He didn't rebuild it. Serena Vale, 30 years old, died in a storm at sea in September, 3 months after leaving England, 6 months after he had sent her away with a note from his solicitor. She had traveled to the continent and taken a ship somewhere, and the weather had found her, and she was gone. And she had been gone for weeks already without him knowing, and the world had continued turning in the interval the way the world did, without consultation, without courtesy, without any regard for the particular human disaster of a man sitting in his East Study realizing, too late and all at once, what he'd had and what he'd done with it. He had sent her away. He had sent her away, and she had not made a scene, and she had not written him letters of recrimination, and she had not, he was increasingly certain, told anyone what she knew about Crowley, or the Northern Alliances, or whatever else she'd been quietly managing, because she had understood that it was not her information to weaponize. She had walked out of his East Study with her green wool dress and her gloves and her 4 years of everything, and she had left, and she had died. And he would never... He stopped the thought. He was getting very good at stopping thoughts. He sat in the East Study in the dark and listened to the rain. Bak. The letters arrived in January. There were 7 of them, sealed and bundled together, addressed in Serena's hand. That small, precise script he would have recognized across a room. They had been held by a solicitor in Bath, a man named Ferrars, with instructions that they be forwarded to Blackthorn Hall in the event of her death. She had written them before she left. Adrian held the bundle in his hands for a long time before opening the first one. The first letter was brief. It was dated February, before the announcement, before Hadfield's note, before the Saturday when she had stood in his East Study and pulled on her gloves. She had written it in February, which meant she had written it while she was still here, while she was still walking through his world and watching it and managing the parts of it she'd silently claimed. And she had written it because she had known, somehow, with the quiet certainty that characterized everything she did, that she would eventually not be here to say these things in person. He read the first letter. He read the second. He was on the third when his hand went still on the page, and the blood left his face in a way that was almost architectural. He could feel it happening, could feel the specific quality of recognition that lives below thought, that lives in the body before the mind catches up. Because the third letter was not about the Northern Alliances, and it was not about Crowley, and it was not about any of the individual threads he'd been pulling at in the dark. The third letter was about a man named Aldrich Vane, and what it said about Aldrich Vane, about his access to the Blackthorn family records, about his relationship to the creditors who had circled the dukedom during the darkest years, about the documents Serena had found in the old records room in Blackthorn Hall's lower wing, documents she had photographed and catalogued and held. What the letter said was not a collection of suspicions. It was evidence. Meticulous, sourced, dated, cross-referenced evidence. The work of someone who had been watching a single long-running scheme for years and had documented it with the patience of a person who understood that the truth only helps you if you can prove it. Aldrich Vane was not a minor figure in Adrian's world. Aldrich Vane had been appointed his chief family advisor 18 months ago, after the death of the previous incumbent. He had access to the legal records, the estate documents, the financial frameworks that governed everything the Blackthorn name meant in practical terms. He had Adrian's trust. He had attended the engagement dinner. He had sat 3 seats from Vivian and made a toast and smiled the particular smile of a man who knows something the room doesn't. Adrian sat with the third letter and read it 3 times. Then he went to the lower shelf of the East Studies document cabinet, where Serena had apparently, according to the letter, placed a secondary copy of the most critical documents. He found the envelope exactly where she said it would be. He opened it. The documents were there, dated, signed. A chain of correspondence between Vane and parties outside the country that, laid against the timeline of the Blackthorn family's worst financial years, told a story that made the room feel like it was tilting. His chest was doing something he didn't have a name for. Not grief, not rage, or not only those things. Something that was all of it at once and something else beneath it. Something that had no clean category. The specific horror of understanding that while he had been arranging his life around appearance and alliance and the social machinery of position, Serena Vale had been standing between him and the thing that could have destroyed everything he was. And she had done it quietly, without being asked, without credit, and without requiring anything from him in return. He had sent her away anyway. He had sent her away, and she had died, and she had left him these letters, and the man who had been systematically working toward the destruction of the Blackthorn legacy for years was currently seated in the east wing of his own estate, 6 rooms away, in the private apartments Adrian had provided as a courtesy to a trusted member of his household. His hand closed on the edge of the desk. Outside, January moved through the old elms with its usual indifference. He picked up the remaining 4 letters, and the first line of the 4th letter stopped him cold. Stopped his breath, stopped his hand, stopped everything. Because Serena had written it in ink that had pressed harder than usual, as though the words had cost her something, and what it said was this: "There is one more thing you need to know, Adrian, something I found in Vane's correspondence that I have not told anyone, and that changes the shape of everything you think you understand about the night your father died." The 4th letter was 2 pages. Adrian read it standing up, which was not something he did. He was a man who sat for correspondence, who maintained the physical posture of composure as a matter of discipline. His father had taught him that, drilled it into him through 1,000 formal occasions where the body's stillness communicated what the voice was not permitted to say. He stood now because he had not made a conscious decision to stand. His body had made it for him somewhere around the 3rd sentence, when the meaning of what Serena had written began to land in full. The night his father died. Gerald Blackthorn, the previous Duke, had died 4 years ago in what the physicians recorded as cardiac failure. He had been 62. He had been, by every account Adrian possessed, in imperfect but not critical health, the kind of health that carried a man another decade if nothing intervened. Adrian had been in Edinburgh when it happened, had ridden back through 2 nights to reach Blackthorn Hall before the morning of the 4th day, and had arrived to find his father already laid out in the household in the particular suspended state of grief that precedes the mechanics of death. He had accepted the physician's account. He had had no reason not to. Serena's letter gave him reasons. She had found, in Vane's personal correspondence, access through means she described in the letter with her characteristic precision and without apology. A series of exchanges between Vane and a physician named Creel. Not the physician who had attended Gerald Blackthorn in his final days. A different physician, one whose name did not appear in any of the official documentation surrounding the Duke's death, but who had been present at Blackthorn Hall in the week preceding it, listed in the household records under a false entry as a visiting land agent from Devon. The exchanges between Vane and Creel spanned 14 months. They began, Serena had noted, 8 months before Gerald Blackthorne died, and they concerned, in the indirect and carefully worded language of men who understood that letters could be read by the wrong people, the management of a prolonged deterioration that would appear, to any standard medical examination, entirely natural. Adrian set the letter down on the desk. He picked it up again. He read the relevant passage a third time, because the first 2 readings had not fully resolved the information into something his mind could hold as real. His father had been a difficult man. Brilliant, demanding, occasionally cruel in the particular way of men who mistake severity for strength. Adrian had not grieved him easily or cleanly, but he had grieved him as a man grieves his father, with the complicated, layered grief of someone who loved what the person might have been as much as what they were, and who understood that the two things could not be fully separated. What Serena's letter was telling him was that Aldrich Vane had arranged his father's death, not caused it, not precisely. The letter was careful, as Serena was always careful with what she could and could not definitively prove, but orchestrated the conditions, managed the physician, timed it. 4 years ago, before he was appointed chief family advisor, before he had any official standing in the Blackthorne household, Vane had been positioning himself for exactly the role he now occupied, and the primary obstacle to that position had been a duke with the sharp political instincts to recognize a maneuvering man and the authority to close every door before the maneuvering could reach critical mass. Gerald Blackthorne had known something was wrong. There was a line in the 14th letter in the Vane-Creel correspondence that Serena had transcribed directly, and reading it, Adrian could feel the cold move through him from the inside out, the kind of cold that has nothing to do with the temperature of the room. The old man asked questions at dinner that suggest he is becoming aware of certain arrangements. The timeline must be accelerated. Adrian's hand was entirely steady. That was the thing he noticed. He had expected his hand to shake, had expected the news to move through him with the physical force of something detonating. Instead, there was a stillness in him that was not calm, that was nothing like calm, but that had a quality of absolute clarity to it. The kind of clarity that comes when a man stops hoping he is wrong about something and accepts that he is right, and begins to organize what happens next. He folded the letter. He set it with the others. He crossed the east study to the document cabinet and stood before the lower shelf where Serena had placed the secondary evidence package. He opened it fully this time, spread the contents across the desk surface, and began to read through it with the systematic attention of a man who has been given, finally, all the pieces of a thing he has been trying to understand in the dark. It took him 2 hours. Vane was in the East Wing. Adrian knew his schedule with the automatic familiarity of a man who has lived in close proximity to another for long enough that the other person's rhythms become part of the furniture of the day. Vane dined at 7. He retired to the library at 8:30 for a period of solitary reading he'd maintained since his appointment. He received no visitors after 9. He was, by every visible indicator, a man of impeccable and somewhat severe personal discipline. The performance of it, Adrian now understood, had been part of the design. He did not go to the East Wing that night. This was a decision that cost him something. He could feel the cost of it in the muscles of his shoulders, the jaw he kept finding clenched when he caught himself. Every instinct that had been rewired by the last 2 hours of reading told him to move, to act, to cross the distance between the East Study and the East Wing and put his hand on Vane's throat and ask him, very quietly, about a physician from Devon and 14 months of correspondence and a 62-year-old man who had asked questions at dinner. He didn't move. He sat behind his desk, and he thought about Serena Vale, who had held this information and had not acted on pure instinct, who had gathered and documented and verified, who had understood that a man like Vane would only be brought down by something airtight, something that couldn't be dismissed or reframed or buried by the kind of legal and political machinery that men like Vane always had access to. She had been patient for years, and she had been right to be patient, and she was dead, and he was going to have to be as patient as she had been, or everything she had done would count for nothing. He poured himself a drink. He drank half of it. He sat with the remaining letters, 5 through 7, and opened them one at a time. The fifth outlined the political dimension. The northern alliances that had been destabilizing were not random. They were being managed. Vane had relationships with three of the lords who had gone cold on the Blackthorn camp, and those relationships predated his appointment by years. He had been, Serena wrote, positioned inside the household specifically to have access to the mechanisms that would make the destabilization possible: the financial documentation, the political correspondence, the private communications between Adrian and his allies that Vane had access to as chief advisor, and had been selectively leaking to enemies who knew exactly how to use them. The sixth letter was shorter. Serena had written it in a different ink, which meant she had written it at a different time, and the handwriting had a quality that Adrian recognized, the quality of a person writing quickly, under pressure, without the luxury of revision. It said, "I don't know how much time I have to finish this properly. The Ferrars arrangement is in place. If you're reading this, it means something happened to me. I want you to know that I am not saying that for dramatic effect. I found something in early February that suggested Vane may have become aware that I was watching him. I don't know how. I have been careful. But I think the fact that I have begun to feel watched rather than watching means the calculus has changed, and I needed to tell someone that, even if the only way I could tell you was through a dead letter." Adrian read the paragraph 3 times. She had known she was in danger. She had known it, and she had continued to document, and she had not told him, could not tell him, presumably, because telling him would have required explaining everything she knew and why she knew it. And she had not wanted to bring it to him in pieces, had wanted to bring it complete and provable. And then he had sent her away. And then she had left the country. He thought about the sea in late September. He thought about the Bay of Biscay, which he knew from his own maritime crossings, the particular unpredictability of it, the speed with which the weather could reorganize itself from passable to catastrophic. He thought about a ship in that weather. He put those thoughts somewhere he would not look at until he could afford to. The seventh letter was 3 lines. It read, "The documents in the lower cabinet are organized by date. Start with the red-tabbed folder. The name you need is not the name you've been given. His real name is Aldrich Vane Moreau. He is the son of a man your father ruined. He has been planning this since before you became Duke. I'm sorry I couldn't finish it. S." He slept 3 hours. He was up before the household, in the records room on the lower floor, a room he had not entered more than a handful of times in the years he'd occupied the hall, because it was the territory of archivists and solicitors and the kind of patient administrative labor that he had always, efficiently and carelessly, delegated. He found the red-tabbed folder where Serena had said it would be. He opened it. The name Moreau appeared in documents dated 18 years back. An old business matter, a land dispute that had gone badly for one of the involved parties, resolved in the Blackthorn family's favor through legal and political channels that, reading them now, Adrian could see had not been entirely clean. A family from the northern provinces, a man named Claude Moreau, who had lost a significant holding as the result of a debt arrangement that had been, at minimum, aggressively structured. A man who had died 5 years after the resolution, in circumstances that the documents described as financial ruin, and that Adrian, given what he was currently reading, was no longer inclined to take at face value. A son, Aldrich. Documented in the family records as a minor at the time. He would have been 17. Old enough to understand what had happened. Old enough to remember. Adrian sat on the floor of the records room, an undignified posture he would not have permitted himself in other circumstances, and spread the documents around him and assembled piece by piece the architecture of what Aldrich Vane Moreau had built. Not quickly. Not in a fury of reactivity. 20 years of it. A constructed identity, a false name, a career built specifically to position himself inside the household of the man he held responsible for his father's destruction. And then, one by one, the mechanisms. The physician, the letters, the political maneuvering, the financial erosion. Methodical, patient. The kind of patient that has its roots in something cold and deep and old. He had been inside Adrian's house for 18 months. He had eaten at Adrian's table. He had made a toast at Adrian's engagement dinner and smiled. Adrian was on his feet before he consciously decided to stand, and this time he didn't stop himself. Vane was in the breakfast room. It was 7:45 in the morning. He had his coffee and his papers in the arrangement he maintained every day with the consistency of a clock, and he looked up when Adrian entered, and his expression did the thing that Adrian had watched it do 100 times. The composed, attentive realignment of a man positioning himself to be useful. "Your Grace, you're up early." Adrian pulled out the chair across from him and sat down. He set nothing on the table. He had brought nothing with him. Everything he had was in his head. "Tell me about your father," Adrian said. The silence that followed was brief. A professional's silence, controlled, not panicked. "I beg your pardon?" "Your father," Adrian said. "Tell me about him." Vane set his coffee cup down with the careful precision of a man buying himself 2 seconds. "I'm not sure I follow, Your Grace. Is there something specific?" "Claude Moreau," Adrian said. "Northern provinces. Land dispute, resolved 18 years ago. A holding lost to a debt arrangement with the Blackthorn estate." He watched Vane's face. "You look like him, actually. I had to dig a bit to find documents with his image, but once I did, the resemblance was fairly clear, the eyes especially." Something happened in Vane's face that lasted less than a second. Adrian caught it because he was looking for it. The specific microsecond in which the constructed surface met something it hadn't been built to handle and the seam showed. Then Vane smiled. It was a different smile than the one Adrian was used to, smaller. Something genuinely felt had replaced the professional warmth, and what was genuine in Vane's face, Adrian discovered, was not particularly pleasant to look at. "Well," Vane said, "I wondered how long." "Longer than it should have taken me," Adrian said. "Yes." Vane leaned back in his chair, and the posture was different now. The performance was down, and what replaced it was something older and more settled. "Considerably longer. You're not a careless man, Your Grace. That surprised me initially. I had to adjust the timeline twice in the first year. For my father." The silence. "Among other things," Vane said. Adrian's hands were flat on the table. He kept them there. "Among other things," he repeated. "I want you to say it directly." "Do you?" Vane looked at him with the steady gaze of a man who has been carrying a thing for 2 decades and has finally set it down and is assessing the weight of the absence. "Why? What does it change for you at this point?" "Nothing," Adrian said. "I want to hear you say it." Something shifted in Vane's expression, a recognition maybe of the particular quality of what was happening in the room. 2 men across a breakfast table, and one of them had been waiting 20 years for this moment, and the other had been asleep for most of it. "Your father destroyed mine," Vane said. His voice was entirely level. "Not carelessly, deliberately. He saw a smaller man with a valuable holding, and he used his legal resources and his political connections to take it. And he did it knowing exactly what the consequences would be for the people involved, and he went home to his dinner and didn't think about it again. My father thought about nothing else for the last 5 years of his life." He paused. "So, yes, I accelerated certain conditions. I ensured that a physician was available who understood what was required. Your father died the way my father died. Slowly, watching everything that defined his existence erode around him, unable to stop it." He picked up his coffee cup. "I thought that was appropriate." The room was very quiet. "Get out of this house," Adrian said. "I assume so," Vane said, setting the cup down. "I should tell you, though, that the documents you found, assuming you found them, and your demeanor suggests you have, are not the complete picture. There are parties involved in the Northern Alliance matter who will not simply retreat because I do. The machine keeps running without the engineer. That's by design." "I know," Adrian said. Something flickered in Vane's face, a brief, genuine surprise that was almost satisfying. "She documented everything," Adrian said. "All of it. The northern contacts, the financial structure, the dependency chains. She was more thorough than you accounted for." The name didn't need to be said. Vane knew. The flicker in his expression said he knew, and beneath the knowing there was something that Adrian found he could not fully categorize, a reaction to the name that was not quite satisfaction. Not quite. "Miss Vale," Vane said quietly. "Yes, I became aware of her in February. He was silent a moment. I want you to understand that the voyage was her choice. I did nothing to... Stop, Adrian said. The word landed in the room like something thrown. Vane stopped. Get out of this house, Adrian said again. You have 2 hours. After that, what I do with what I know becomes a matter for public record and for every legal and political contact I have in this country and outside it. You understand me? Vane rose from the table. He straightened his jacket with the habitual precision of a man who maintains his surfaces even when the thing beneath them is finished. He looked at Adrian across the breakfast table for a long moment. She was the only person in this household who actually saw me, Vane said. For what it's worth. Adrian said nothing. Vane walked to the door. He paused with his hand on the frame, an unconscious echo that Adrian registered and then pushed away from, hard, because that was a door he could not open right now, not if he was going to get through the next hour and the one after that, and all the hours that came after those. The physician Creel is in Manchester, Vane said, without turning. If you're building a case, he'll talk if the alternative is worse than talking. He stepped through the door. I imagine you'll make it worse. His footsteps moved down the corridor. Adrian sat at the breakfast table in the empty room and looked at the coffee cup Vane had left behind and thought about a 17-year-old boy in the northern provinces watching everything his father had built get taken apart by the legal machinery of a man who would not think about it again at dinner. He sat with that for exactly as long as he could afford to. Then he got up and went to find Hadfield because the machine was still running and Serena had left him the tools to dismantle it, and the only thing he could do for her now was use them. He was halfway down the corridor when Pemberton appeared from the direction of the entrance hall with the expression that meant something had arrived and the something was not expected. Your Grace, there is a woman at the door. Pemberton paused. She says her name is Miss Avery. She says she was traveling companion to Miss Vale during the voyage. He paused again. She says Miss Vale gave her something to deliver in person, and only to you. Adrian stood in the corridor of Blackthorn Hall and felt the ground shift under him in a way that had nothing to do with the floor. Bring her in, he said. Her name was Clara Avery, and she was 24 years old, and she had the look of someone who had not slept properly in weeks. She sat in the receiving room off the entrance hall, not the East Study. Adrian had made that call without thinking. Some instinct that the East Study was already carrying too much weight for one morning, and she held a leather satchel on her lap with both hands, the way a person holds something they have been told is important and have been afraid of losing ever since. She was plainly dressed, dark-haired, with the kind of face that was not remarkable until you looked at it long enough to see the intelligence working behind the exhaustion. Adrian sat across from her. Pemberton had brought tea that neither of them touched. You were traveling with her, Adrian said. From Dover, Clara Avery said. We met on the coach. I didn't know who she was at first. She was quiet. She read a great deal. She paused, looking at the satchel. We became friendly over a few days. I was going to visit family in Lisbon. She didn't tell me where she was going, not specifically. She said she needed to be somewhere that wasn't England for a while. How long were you traveling together before the crossing? 3 weeks, through France mostly. She was good company when she wanted to be. Very precise about things. Times, arrangements, details. She never forgot anything. Clara Avery looked up. She talked about you. The room was very still. What did she say? Adrian said. She wasn't unkind about it. She wasn't the kind of person who needed to be unkind to make a point. Clara's hands tightened slightly on the satchel. She said she'd left some things unfinished, and she was trying to decide whether unfinished things could be fixed from a distance or whether they had to be left. She paused. I didn't understand what she meant at the time. And on the crossing. The weather was wrong from the first hour. Everyone could feel it. Her voice went careful and flat in the way of someone recounting something that has been replaying behind their eyes for weeks. It got bad very quickly. There were not enough boats. There was a lot of confusion. She found me on the deck and she gave me this. She placed the satchel on the table between them. She said, if you make it and I don't, take this to a duke named Blackthorn in London. She told me where the hall was. She made me repeat the address. She was very calm about it. Clara Avery stopped. I asked her why she wasn't getting in the boat. She said she was going to make sure I got in first. Adrian looked at the satchel. She didn't get in, Clara Avery said. He did not say anything for a long moment. Thank you, he said finally, for coming, for keeping it safe. She was a very particular kind of person. Clara Avery stood because she could see that she was done here, that the man across from her needed the room to himself and the thing on the table. She was perceptive. Serena would have liked that about her. I'm sorry for your loss, Your Grace. She left. Pemberton showed her out. Adrian sat alone in the receiving room and looked at the satchel for a full minute before he opened it. Inside was a journal, small, leather-bound, the kind that fit in a coat pocket. And beneath it, folded in oilcloth, waterproofed, prepared, because Serena prepared for everything, a single document. Handwritten, dense, dated the week before the crossing. He read the document first. It took him 20 minutes. When he finished, he sat with it in his hands and understood, with a completeness that left no room for qualification, that Serena Vale had not simply been protecting him from Vane's scheme. She had, in the final weeks before she left England, identified something that Vane's scheme had been designed to obscure, a second layer, deeper, that Vane himself may not have fully understood he was part of. The document named 4 men. 2 were lords of significant political standing. 1 was a senior official in the Treasury, and 1 was Hadfield, his solicitor, his trusted solicitor of 11 years. The man he had called this morning to begin dismantling Vane's network. The man who had access to every legal mechanism Adrian now intended to deploy. The man who, according to Serena's document, had been receiving payments routed through a Zurich account for 3 years in exchange for selective intelligence about the Blackthorn estate's legal vulnerabilities. Adrian set the document down on the table next to the untouched tea. He thought about the morning. He thought about calling Hadfield in, telling him about Vane, beginning to outline the response. He thought about Hadfield's face, composed, professional, distressed on Adrian's behalf, in exactly the calibrated way of a man who is also calculating what Adrian's next move means for his own position. He thought about the specific things he had told Hadfield this morning, including specifically that Vane was leaving the premises. His chair was moving before the thought completed. He was in the corridor moving toward the east wing at a pace that was not quite running but was everything short of it, and he was thinking, not feeling, not yet, that would come later. He was thinking about the 2 hours he had given Vane, and about Hadfield knowing Vane was leaving, and about the specific window of time that created, and about whether Vane and Hadfield had a communication channel that could be activated in the 45 minutes since he'd sat down in the receiving room with Clara Avery. The East Wing guest apartments were empty, not packed and departed, empty. Wrong empty. The wardrobe open, half the contents gone, the rest left in the disordered way of a man who had been moving fast. The desk cleared of papers with the completeness of someone who knew what they were leaving behind and had made specific choices. On the floor near the fireplace, ash, recent. Something burned within the last hour. Adrian stood in the center of the room and looked at the ash and understood that Vane had not waited 2 hours. Vane had left within 20 minutes of walking out of the breakfast room, which meant Vane had known, before Adrian told him, that something was coming, which meant he'd been warned, and the only person who could have warned him was... Adrian was already turning. Stuck. Hadfield was in the east study. He had let himself in. He had a key, had always had a key. 11 years of trust meant a key. And he was standing at the document cabinet when Adrian walked through the door, and the particular quality of where he was standing and what his hands were doing told Adrian everything he needed to know in the half-second before Hadfield turned around. "Your Grace," Hadfield said. His voice was entirely composed. "I was looking for the Crowley documentation. I thought we might need it for—" "Step away from the cabinet," Adrian said. Hadfield looked at him, then he stepped away. The 2 men stood in the east study and looked at each other across the distance of 11 years, and Adrian felt something shift in his chest that was not grief and was not fury, but was the specific cold of a man recalculating everything he thought he knew about a decade of his own life. "How long?" Adrian said. Hadfield was quiet for a moment. He was 60, gray-haired, with the kind of steady professional face that had always communicated reliability. Adrian was looking at that face now and trying to find what had been underneath it, and finding the attempt almost physically disorienting, like pressing on a wall you had leaned against for years and feeling it give. 3 years, Hadfield said. What did you tell him this morning? That you'd found the documents, that Vane was leaving. He paused. That you'd found the letters. Serena's letters. Yes. The room was very quiet. Outside, the January wind moved through the elms. You knew about her, Adrian said. What she was doing. I knew she was watching things she shouldn't have been watching, Hadfield said. I didn't... He stopped. Something crossed his face that may have been the beginning of discomfort. I didn't know the full scope of what she'd compiled until recently. Did Vane know she had the Moreau documentation? Not until February, when she accessed certain records through channels that she was careful, but not careful enough. He became aware. Hadfield's voice stayed level. I want you to understand that I had no involvement in what happened on the crossing. I want that to be absolutely clear. What happened on the crossing, Adrian said, was a storm. Yes. You're telling me that's all it was? The silence that followed was 2 seconds long and told Adrian more than a direct answer would have. I told Vane she was leaving England, Hadfield said. I told him her departure date and her intended route. That is the extent of what I provided. He met Adrian's eyes. What he did with that information, if he did anything, I cannot account for. The calculation happened in Adrian's mind with a speed and coldness that he hadn't known himself capable of. Hadfield was a solicitor. He understood evidence. He had chosen his words with precision. I cannot account for. Not he did nothing. Not it was only the storm. He had built himself a legal wall out of the passive voice and the limits of direct knowledge, and he was standing behind it and looking at Adrian with the eyes of a man who believes the wall will hold. Adrian walked to his desk. He sat down. He put his hands flat on the surface, a deliberate echo of the breakfast table, an hour ago, another man in another room. And he looked at Hadfield and he spoke very quietly. Sit down. Hadfield sat. You're going to tell me everything, Adrian said. Every name, every payment, every communication, every instruction you received, and every piece of information you provided. All of it. You're going to tell me in the order it happened, and you're not going to curate it, and you're not going to protect anyone, including yourself. And if I decline, you won't decline. Adrian's voice had no heat in it. That was the thing Hadfield would notice, Adrian knew. That was the thing that communicated more than anger would have. Because you've practiced law for 30 years and you understand exactly what I'm holding and what I'm capable of doing with it. And you understand that the only version of what happens next in which you are not completely destroyed is the one in which you make yourself useful to me right now. He let that sit for a moment. And because you knew Serena Vale, and you knew what she was, and you told a man where she was going. Hadfield's face did something then. Something that was not quite guilt. Men like Hadfield had processed guilt into something more manageable long ago, but that was in the same neighborhood, a flinch in the professional composure, a hairline crack. Start talking, Adrian said. It took 90 minutes. Hadfield talked with the methodical precision of a man surrendering ground he had already decided was indefensible, preserving his energy for the positions he still thought he could hold. Adrian let him structure it that way. He took no notes. He didn't trust pen and paper in this room anymore, didn't trust what might be accessed, and he held every name and figure and date in his head with the concentrated attention of a man who understands that this particular conversation is going to be the foundation of everything that comes next. The two lords were Lord Ashby and Lord Carew. Both had been receiving intelligence about Blackthorn financial vulnerabilities for 2 years. Both had used that intelligence to position themselves favorably in the pending northern land arrangements that Adrian had been maneuvering toward. The Treasury official, a man named Price, had been providing regulatory cover for certain of the account structures that moved money through Vane's network. The arrangement was not Vane's design, Hadfield said. Vane had been recruited into something already in motion, something older, Whose design? Adrian said. Hadfield was quiet for a moment. Lord Carew, he said finally. Carew has been building this for 6 years. Vane was an instrument, a very willing instrument with his own motivations, but an instrument. And you? I was approached 4 years ago. He didn't look away. After your father died. There was a suggestion that my continued involvement with the Blackthorn Estate's legal affairs might be professionally complicated if I didn't make certain information available when asked. They threatened you. They gave me a choice, Hadfield said. I made it badly. Adrian looked at him for a long time. Lord Carew attended my engagement dinner, he said. Yes. He made a toast. Yes. He has been in this house. He has sat at my table. He has... Adrian stopped himself. The anger was there underneath the cold, and he could feel it wanting to surface. And he knew with the instinct of someone who has been running an estate since 19 that the anger was not useful right now. The anger was for later. Right now, he needed the cold. Where is Vane going? He said. I don't know. He has, resources I'm not fully aware of. Money moved years ago into accounts I don't have access to. Carew. Where is Carew? His country estate in Wiltshire, I believe. He has no reason to think... Hadfield paused. He doesn't know you have the letters. No, Adrian said. He doesn't. He stood up. Hadfield watched him. You're going to stay in this house, Adrian said. You're not going to communicate with anyone. Not Carew, not Price, not anyone connected to this. You're going to write down everything you told me in the last 90 minutes, in your own hand, signed and dated, and you're going to give it to Pemberton to hold. Not to me, to Pemberton. He came around the desk. You try to leave, Pemberton has instructions. You attempt to contact anyone, I will know before the hour is out, and the version of what happens to you will be the one you really don't want. Do you understand me? Yes, Hadfield said. Good. Adrian walked to the door. He stopped with his hand on the frame. She trusted you, he said. He said it to the wall, not to Hadfield. She brought you documentation about Crowley. She worked in your vicinity for 4 years. She trusted you the way you trust the furniture, because you were always there and she had no reason to think the floor was made of something that gave. Hadfield said nothing. That's the part I'm going to remember, Adrian said, not the rest of it, that part. He walked out. The ride to Wiltshire was 4 hours. He went alone. No, not alone. He took 2 men from the household staff he'd known since childhood, men whose loyalty was the kind you didn't manufacture, the kind that had roots in shared years. And he rode through the January afternoon with the documents in the waterproofed oilcloth inside his coat and Serena's journal in his inside pocket, against his chest where the cold couldn't reach it. He thought about Carew. Lord Edmund Carew, 61, a man he had known since he was a boy, a man who had attended his father's funeral and stood at the graveside with the appropriate expression and said the appropriate things, a man who had been building a 6-year mechanism designed to dismantle everything the Blackthorn name meant, and who had stood at a graveside of his own manufacturing and said the appropriate things. He thought about the shape of it, the patience required, the sheer structural patience of building something over 6 years with the understanding that you might not see the results for a decade. He thought about what produced that kind of patience in a man. What kind of grievance, what kind of cold, long-burning purpose could sustain a construction that elaborate over that much time? He thought about Vane in the northern provinces at 17, watching. He thought about the men who had made Vane what he became. He was not excusing Vane. He was not excusing any of it. But he was looking at the architecture of his own history and seeing, for the first time with full clarity, that his family name had not only produced him, it had produced consequences. Ripples. Debts that had never been acknowledged and therefore had never been paid, that had compounded in the dark for years until they reached him in the form of a conspiracy he had been too comfortable to see coming. He had been comfortable. That was the word. He had been comfortable and Serena had not been comfortable on his behalf, had been watching and managing and absorbing the discomfort that should have been his, and he had not even had the basic awareness to know what she was doing. The Carew estate appeared on the horizon as the light was going. Adrian pulled his horse to a stop on the ridge above it and looked down at the house. Large, stone-built, lanterns lit in the lower windows, smoke from several chimneys. A working household on an ordinary January evening. A man inside it who had no idea that the morning's events had moved at the speed they had moved, who had received no warning because Hadfield had been contained before he could send one. He had the advantage. He had Serena's documents. He had Hadfield's confession in the process of being written. He had the Moreau records and the Creole correspondence and the Vane Carew communications that Serena had transcribed. He had, against every probability of the last 6 months, something close to a complete hand. What he did not have was Serena. He sat on the ridge above Lord Carew's estate in the dying January light and felt that absence as a specific physical weight, not grief, not yet, he couldn't let it be grief yet, but a weight. The weight of understanding that the woman who had assembled everything he was holding had assembled it without ever intending to give it to him this way. She had been building toward a moment when she could walk back into a room and put it on his desk and say, "Here, I finished it," and have him look at her, actually look at her, and understand what she had done and what it had cost her and what she had never once asked him for in return. That moment would not happen. He could not give her that moment. What he could give her was the use of what she'd built. What he could do was ride down off this ridge and walk into that house and take apart, piece by piece, the thing that had been constructed in the dark around his name, and do it with the precision and patience she had modeled for him, even when she'd had no reason to model anything for him at all. He touched the journal through the fabric of his coat. Then he touched his horse's flank and rode down toward the lights. He was halfway down the ridge when he saw the second set of riders coming from the west, 4 of them, moving fast, with the specific urgency of men carrying news. And he recognized the lead rider's horse before he could see the man clearly, and his stomach dropped 6 inches inside him, because the lead rider was one of Carew's men, a man he had seen at the engagement dinner, a man who should not have known to come here, should not have had any reason to be riding toward Carew's estate with that urgency on this specific evening, unless Vane had not left England alone, unless Vane had left with exactly enough information to make one communication before he disappeared, and that communication had not been to Hadfield. Adrian stopped his horse. The riders reached the estate gates below him. He watched the lead rider dismount, watched the door open, watched the specific energy of emergency move through the lantern-lit entrance as the household absorbed whatever news had just arrived. Carew knew. He pulled his horse around to face his 2 men, and in the last gray light of the January afternoon, he looked at them and understood that the version of tonight he had planned, controlled, precise, the careful deployment of evidence by a man holding a complete hand, was no longer the version he was in. He was in a different version. In this version, Carew had 30 minutes on him and knew he was coming, and every advantage Adrian had brought to this ridge was now a liability, because a prepared man on his own ground with 30 minutes and resources was not the same problem as a man caught by surprise. And Adrian had exactly 2 choices: ride down and force the confrontation now, without the controlled conditions he needed, with Carew already moving whatever he needed to move and burning whatever he needed to burn, or pull back. Regroup. Approach this differently. He sat on the ridge in the dying light, and he thought about Serena, who had been patient for years, and about what patience had cost her, and about what impatience would cost him now. He thought about Carew burning documents in the next 30 minutes. He thought about Vane somewhere in the dark between here and the coast. He thought about 6 years of construction and 1 evening to dismantle it, and the specific cruelty of being one conversation away from the truth and finding the door already closing. His hand was on his reins. His horse shifted under him. And then Pemberton's voice was in his head. Not Pemberton, exactly, but Serena's note in Pemberton's delivery, the note she'd left in the Haverfield folder. I haven't confirmed the connection yet, but the timing is wrong. She had not moved until she was certain. He turned his horse. He rode back over the ridge into the dark, and the wind came up hard from the west, and somewhere in that wind was the specific, unforgiving knowledge that the man he had been 6 months ago, the man who had sent a note through his solicitor and not watched its recipient read it, who had sat behind his desk while someone else stood, who had been comfortable, that man would not survive what was coming. He was going to have to become someone else. He was going to have to become the kind of man Serena had always seen when she looked at him, the kind she'd been protecting and waiting for and never quite given up on, right until the end. He didn't know yet if he was capable of it. He rode into the dark to find out. He rode through the night, not back to Blackthorn Hall. That instinct he killed before it fully formed, because Blackthorn Hall was the first place a prepared man would expect him to go, and a prepared man with 6 years of architecture behind him would have contingencies for the obvious moves. Adrian was done making obvious moves. He had been making obvious moves his entire adult life and calling it strategy, and the result was a conspiracy he hadn't seen coming and a woman dead in the Bay of Biscay and a solicitor of 11 years who had been selling him in pieces for 3. He rode to Harwick, a village 12 miles southeast of the Carew estate, small enough to have one inn and large enough that a man arriving after dark didn't constitute an event. He knew it because his father had stopped there once, years ago, on a journey that had gone long, and Adrian had been 14 and had sat in the inn's low-ceilinged common room and eaten the best bread he could ever remember eating and thought that some places existed outside the machinery of consequence. He took a room. He sent his 2 men to stable the horses and sleep. He sat at the small desk in the room's single chair, and he opened Serena's journal. He had not let himself read it yet. He had been holding it against his chest for 4 hours on horseback, and had not opened it because opening it was the thing he was least certain he could do and still function, and functioning was the only thing that mattered until this was finished. He opened it now. Her handwriting was the same as the letters, small, precise, unadorned. The early entries were dated from more than a year ago and concerned, in her characteristic manner, practical observations, household matters, a note about the Tennyson correspondence, a brief and dry assessment of a dinner party she had attended that made him exhale something that was almost a laugh before it became something else entirely. She wrote the way she spoke, without ornamentation, without the performed interiority that filled most journals he'd encountered. She wrote what she saw and what she thought about what she saw, and the gap between the two was always exactly as narrow as it needed to be. He read forward. The entries from February were different, shorter. The handwriting the same, but the pressure behind it changed. He could feel it in the indentations on the page, the way certain words had been pressed harder than others. She had written, on the 14th of February, "I think Vane knows. I can't confirm it, but the way he looked at me across the breakfast room this morning was different from how he looked at me last week, and I trust the difference more than I trust the absence of direct evidence. I am going to move the secondary copies today." She had moved the documents the same week Adrian had sent Hadfield's note. She had been managing the threat of Vane discovering her while simultaneously absorbing the news of his engagement to her stepsister, and she had not in a single entry, not in one line, conflated the two things. She had not let her personal situation contaminate her operational clarity. She had kept them in separate columns in her mind and attended to each with the full measure of her attention, and the discipline that required was the kind Adrian was only beginning to understand had never been ordinary. The last entry was dated 3 days before the crossing. It was 2 paragraphs. The first said, "I have done everything I can do from here. The rest is his. I hope he finds it in time. I hope he is the man I have always believed he was capable of being, which is not the man he has been. There is a difference, and I have spent 4 years living in that gap, and I am very tired of it." The second paragraph said, "I don't regret any of it. I want that on record somewhere, even if only here. Not the work, not the watching, not any of it. The only thing I regret is that I never told him directly what I thought of him. Not the version I performed for company, the careful diplomatic version, but the actual assessment. He would have hated it. It would have been useful for him. I should have said it years ago and I didn't, and that is the one thing I'd do differently if I could go back." Adrian sat with those 2 paragraphs for a long time. He closed the journal. He placed it on the desk. He sat in the chair in the small room in Harwick and looked at the wall and let himself feel, for exactly 10 minutes, the full weight of what he was carrying. The grief, and the fury, and the bone-deep shame of a man who has been accurately assessed and found wanting by the one person whose assessment he should have valued most. He let it move through him without fighting it, because fighting it was the old way, the comfortable way, the way of a man who redirected and managed and kept the distance growing until it felt like geography. He sat with it. Then he put it away. Not suppressed, put away. Stored somewhere with full knowledge of its location and full intention to return to it when he could afford to. There was a difference, he was learning, between burying a thing and knowing where you set it down. He pulled out the documents. He worked until 3 a.m. What Serena had built, spread across the desk of a small room in Harwick, was not just evidence. It was a sequence, a map of how one move had led to the next, how each element of Carews' 6-year construction had been designed to reinforce the others, and how, critically, each element also had a specific vulnerability if you approached it from the right direction at the right time. She had noted the vulnerabilities. She had been building toward a strategy. He read her annotations with the focused attention of a man learning a language he should have started years ago, and by 2 a.m. he understood what she had seen and what she had intended to do with it, and by 3 he had adapted her plan to account for the fact that Carew now knew he was coming and Vane was in motion somewhere, and the clock had compressed. The Treasury official, Price, was the first lever, not Carew. Carew was the apex, and you didn't go for the apex first when it was fortified. You went for the structure beneath it, and you removed the supports one at a time until the apex had nothing to stand on. Price was a man who had made a specific kind of calculated risk, the kind that assumes the protected party remains protected. The moment Price understood that the protection was failing, that the architecture he had assumed was solid, was instead a structure someone was methodically disassembling, his calculation would change. Price lived in London. Adrian was in Harwick. He had one man he trusted completely outside the compromised circle of his own household, a man who owed him nothing and to whom he owed a great deal, Lord Marcus Hale, who had served with him briefly in a capacity Adrian rarely discussed and who understood, with the quiet certainty of shared history, that when Adrian asked something of him, it was not asked lightly. He wrote the letter to Hale at 2:30 a.m. He wrote it in the compressed, specific language of a man who doesn't have words to waste, and he told Hale exactly what he needed and when, and what to say to Price when he got there. He sealed it and left it with instructions for his man to ride it to London at first light. Then he slept 3 hours. What? He was on the road back toward Carew's estate by 6. The January morning was gray and cold and very clear, the kind of clear that comes after a hard night and makes everything look like it's been cut from something rather than grown. He rode with his second man, Thomas, who had been with the Blackthorn household since Adrian was 12, and who communicated primarily through the quality of his silences, which were various and expressive. And he thought about what Carew had done with his 30-minute warning. Burned documents, certainly. Moved money if he could move it fast enough. Contacted whatever legal representation he maintained for exactly this kind of emergency. Possibly contacted Price, which would complicate the Hale approach but not destroy it. Possibly contacted the 2 lords, Ashby and the other one, to coordinate a response. What he had not done, Adrian was reasonably certain, was leave his estate. Because leaving looked like flight, and a man of Carew's position understood that flight was not recoverable. You could withstand an accusation if you stood your ground and had resources. You could not withstand one if you ran, because running confirmed the accusation to every audience that mattered before a single piece of evidence was presented. Carew would be there. He would be prepared. He would have his own documents in order, his own version of events, his own legal architecture designed to absorb the impact of whatever Adrian brought to the door. Adrian had Serena's work. He was betting everything on it being enough. Pasut. The gates of the Carew estate were closed. A man stood at them, not a household servant, a man with the particular posture of hired muscle, the kind that gets placed at gates when the man inside has decided to make a point about access. Adrian looked at him from horseback without stopping his approach and watched the man's hand move toward his jacket and then not complete the movement because something in Adrian's pace communicated that stopping was not in the available options. "Open the gate," Adrian said. "Lord Carew is not receiving a... Open the gate." Thomas moved up on his left side, which was all the additional communication the situation required. The man at the gate looked at both of them and made the calculation that men in his position made when the math stopped working in their favor and opened the gate. The drive to the house was a quarter-mile. Adrian rode it at a pace that said he owned the ground under the horse's feet, which was a specific and deliberate performance. The posture of a man who has decided that the only available move is forward, and who has made that decision completely enough that the decision itself becomes its own kind of armor. The front door was opening before he reached it. A manservant, then Carewe's own secretary, then, after a pause long enough to be an assertion of control, Carewe himself, in the doorway of his own house, in the full composure of a man who has spent a night preparing for exactly this. Lord Edmund Carewe was 61, broad-shouldered, white-haired, with the kind of face that had been handsome once and had settled into authority as the handsomeness receded. He looked at Adrian from the doorway with the steady gaze of a man who has decided on his position and intends to occupy it without visible strain. "Blackthorn," he said. "Carewe." Adrian dismounted. "We need to talk." "I believe we do." Carewe stepped aside. "Come in." The study was large, south-facing, lined with the kind of books that were there for the room rather than for reading. A fire. 2 chairs positioned across a low table with the symmetry of a room that had been arranged for exactly this kind of meeting. Adrian noted the arrangement and what it communicated. Carewe had set the stage. Carewe intended to conduct this on his own terms, in his own space, as a conversation between equals with a dispute to manage. Adrian sat in the offered chair. He placed nothing on the table yet. "I'll say this clearly," Carewe said, settling into the opposite chair with the ease of a man on home ground. "I know why you're here. I know what you think you have. And I want to give you the opportunity before this goes any further to consider very carefully whether the course you're contemplating is one you can sustain." "Tell me about my father," Adrian said. The sentence landed in the room the same way it had landed in the breakfast room the morning before, as a specific kind of weight, dropped without warning. Carewe's face absorbed it with better control than Vane's had, but it absorbed it. There was a micro-adjustment behind the eyes that lasted less than a second and told Adrian that this was the question Carewe had not fully prepared for. "Your father," Carewe said, "was a complicated man." "He was murdered," Adrian said. "I'm going to need you to stop talking around that." "That is a very serious allegation." "Yes." "And you believe you have evidence to support it?" "I have Serena Vale's documentation," Adrian said, "all of it. The Vane-Creel correspondence, the Moreau records, the account structures, the communications between you and Vane regarding the Northern alliances, the payments to Hadfield." He watched Carewe's face. "Hadfield gave me a written statement yesterday afternoon. He was very thorough. He wanted to be useful." Something moved through Carewe's expression, a coldness, not surprise exactly, but the recognition of a man who has just seen the structure he built shift under him in a way he hadn't fully accounted for. "Hadfield," he said quietly. "He folded in about 90 minutes, Adrian said, "for what it's worth." The room was very quiet for a moment. Then Carewe leaned forward, and the composure dropped. Not fully, not dramatically, but enough that what was underneath it became visible. And what was underneath it was not the panic Adrian might have expected. It was something older. Something that had been living in this man for a long time and had stopped needing to be managed because it had become part of the furniture of his interior. "Your father," Carewe said, "destroyed my son." The sentence arrived without preamble, and Adrian let it land without moving. Not financially, not professionally. Carewe's voice was entirely level. "My son was 23. He had made a poor choice, a stupid choice, the kind of choice young men make. And your father had leverage over that choice, and he used it. He used it to take something from me that was worth more to him as a weapon than as anything else. And when I went to him, when I sat in his study, the study you now occupy, and I asked him to be reasonable, to consider what he was doing to a boy who had made one mistake." He stopped. "He told me that if I found the situation uncomfortable, I was welcome to move somewhere more comfortable." Adrian said nothing. "I have a son who has not spoken to me in 11 years, Carewe said, because of what was done to him and what was taken from him and what it turned him into. Your father did that. He did it deliberately and without consequence, because men with his name and his resources did not experience consequences. They applied them. He sat back. So yes, I decided that was not an acceptable arrangement. I decided that consequences should be distributed more evenly. By killing him. By removing him, Carew said, and by ensuring that the structures he used to do what he did were systematically dismantled so that they could not be used the same way again. And Serena Vale, Adrian said. His voice had gone very quiet. Where does she fit in the equitable distribution of consequences? The silence that followed had a different quality than the ones before it. Miss Vale's death was a storm, Carew said. I had no... You told Vane where she was going. I passed information to Vane that I believed he would use to discourage her continued investigation. I did not specify methods. You didn't specify methods, Adrian repeated. No. The specific flatness in Adrian's voice when he said, You told a man who murdered my father where a woman was traveling alone, and you didn't specify methods, and she is dead. Carew met his eyes. Yes. Something happened in Adrian's chest that he had been holding at distance for 24 hours, and the effort of continuing to hold it was becoming something he could feel physically, a pressure behind the sternum, a tightening in the jaw. The body's insistence on acknowledging what the mind had been filing under later. He breathed through it. He held Carew's gaze. Lord Hale is in London right now, Adrian said. He is speaking with Price. Price will make the same calculation Hadfield made, and he will make it faster because he is a more frightened man with less spine. By this evening, I will have a second written statement and access to the Treasury documentation Price has been providing cover for. He placed the oilcloth packet on the table between them. This is Serena's primary documentation. There's a secondary copy in a location you will not be able to identify. There are letters with my solicitor, my new solicitor, someone you've never met, with instructions to go to 3 separate parties if I'm not in contact by tomorrow morning. Carew looked at the packet. You have one option, Adrian said. 1. You write down everything, your involvement, Vane's involvement, the Creel arrangement, the Northern Lords, the Hadfield payments, everything. And you sign it, and you give it to me, and you come with me to London, and you say what you know in the rooms where it needs to be said. In exchange, I don't take everything else I have to every newspaper and legal authority in England simultaneously. He held Carew's gaze. You will not escape consequence. I am not offering you escape. I am offering you the version where you have some control over the shape of it. Carew was quiet for a long moment. And if I decline? Then I ride back to London with what I have, and Hale and Price and Hadfield's statement do the work without you, and the version of events that emerges is the one assembled by men who are trying to minimize their own exposure, which means every decision you made and every reasoning behind it gets interpreted by people with no interest in interpreting it fairly. Adrian leaned forward slightly. Or you speak for yourself. The fire in the grate had burned down to a low, steady heat. Carew looked at the packet. He looked at Adrian. He looked at the window where the January morning was gray and clear and indifferent. My son, he said, James, I want it on record that what happened to him was the origin of this. Not greed, not ambition. What was done to him? It'll be on record, Adrian said. You have my word. He wasn't certain yet what his word was worth in the mouth of the man he was currently in the process of becoming. But he meant it. That much was true. Carew looked at him for a long moment. Then he reached for the bell pull and called for his secretary. It took 3 hours to write it all down. Carew wrote with the slow, methodical attention of a man who had always understood the weight of documentation and was applying that understanding now to his own destruction. Adrian sat across from him and read each page as it was completed and said nothing except when something required clarification, which was rarely because Carew was thorough. Outside, the January light moved across the floor of the study as the morning passed, and Adrian sat in the chair that had been arranged for a meeting between equals and read the account of 6 years of calculated dismantling, and he thought about equitable consequences and the price of being comfortable, and he thought about a 17-year-old boy in the northern provinces and a 23-year-old boy who had made one mistake in front of the wrong man, and he thought about the specific machinery of power and what it produced in the people it moved over. He was not absolved by thinking about it. He knew that. The thinking didn't settle any of the accounts. But a man who didn't think about it, a man who took the documents and rode to London and processed the outcome as pure victory, that man would remain exactly as dangerous as his father had been, exactly as capable of the same casual destruction, just pointed in a different direction. He didn't want to be that man. He didn't know yet, fully, how not to be. The last page was signed at 1:30 in the afternoon. Carew set the pen down and looked at what he had written and said nothing. Adrian gathered the pages. He stood. He was reaching for the oilcloth packet when Carew's secretary came through the door, fast, with the particular energy of a man carrying something urgent that he hasn't decided how to communicate. "Your Grace." He was looking at Adrian, not at Carew, which told Adrian the message was for him. A rider just arrived from London, from Lord Hale. He took the note. He read it. Lord Hale had reached Price. Price had not made the same calculation as Hadfield. Price had instead gone directly from his meeting with Hale to Lord Ashby's London townhouse, and Ashby had then sent a messenger to someone. The writer didn't know who, but the direction of the messenger's travel suggested the legal chambers on Fleet Street, where the most aggressive and well-resourced barristers in England maintained their practices. And now there were 4 men in a room on Fleet Street, and whatever they were building in that room, they were building it fast. Adrian read the note twice. He looked up. Carew was watching him from across the desk with the quiet attention of a man reading a situation he has seen before. "They're not going to let you bring this cleanly," Carew said. "Ashby has more resources than I do, deeper roots. He will fight this in every legal arena simultaneously until something is buried or discredited or delayed long enough to lose its force." "I know," Adrian said. "The documentation you have is strong. But strong documentation and a successful outcome are not the same thing when the other side has enough lawyers and enough time." "I know," Adrian said again. He was putting the note in his coat. He was thinking. The thing Serena had built was enough. He was certain of it, had been certain since 3 in the morning in the Harwick Inn. But Serena had built it to be deployed in controlled conditions through proper channels, with the full weight of due process behind it. What Ashby was doing right now was building a wall around those channels, buying time, creating legal complexity designed to exhaust rather than to defend. He needed to cut through the wall before it was finished. He needed something that didn't go through the channels Ashby could block. He needed, and the thought arrived with the cold clarity of something he had been circling without landing on, he needed the one channel that Ashby couldn't close, because it operated entirely outside the legal and political structures that Ashby's resources were designed to navigate. He needed the newspapers. All 3. Simultaneously. With the full documentation and Carew's signed statement and Hadfield's written confession and enough detail that the story was too large and too specific and too corroborated to be quietly managed. He needed to make it public before the wall was finished. He had, by his estimate, 6 hours. He looked at Carew. "Can you ride?" he said. Something moved through Carew's face, surprise, and then something that was almost in the strangest way, respect. "I'm 61, he said. "Not dead." "London," Adrian said. "Now, you're going to repeat everything in that statement in person, to a journalist I trust before nightfall." Carew looked at him for a long moment. Then he stood. "You're very like your father," he said. "In the ways he was formidable. Not in the ways he wasn't." It was the most complicated thing anyone had said to Adrian in a long time. He held it without responding, because there was no response available that was adequate. And Serena had taught him, was still teaching him, apparently, through the evidence of her patience and her work, that silence was sometimes the most honest answer. They were through the door and moving toward the stables when Adrian's man Thomas appeared from the direction of the gate at a pace that stopped them both. Thomas did not run. In 30 years of Adrian's awareness of the man, Thomas had never run. He was running now, and the sight of it hit Adrian's body before his mind had caught up, because Thomas running meant something had changed while they were in the study, and the change was not a small one. Thomas reached him and put a letter in his hand. His face said what his words were still organizing themselves to say. The letter was sealed with a mark Adrian recognized, a London address, a contact in the network of political intelligence he had quietly maintained since his father's time. He broke the seal. He read it. The letter said three things. It said that Vane had been located, not fled, not hiding, but in London, in Ashby's townhouse. Had apparently been there since yesterday evening, which meant he hadn't been running. He'd been going to ground in the most fortified location available while the legal machinery assembled around him. It said that the Fleet Street meeting had produced not a legal strategy, but a document, something being prepared for filing, something that, if the intelligence was accurate, would preemptively challenge the validity of any evidence gathered in the last 48 hours on the grounds of illegal access and procedurally improper documentation. And it said, in the last line, in the flat language of a man delivering news he knows will land hard, that Vivian Ashcroft had been seen entering Ashby's townhouse that morning. Adrian stood in the January afternoon in the gravel drive of Carew's estate, with Thomas breathing hard beside him, and Carew reading his face, and he understood with a completeness that left no room for adjustment that his fiancée had known. Not about Carew, necessarily. Not about the full architecture of it. But she had known something, had understood something about whose protection she was operating inside of, and she had gone this morning, not to him, not to ask or to warn or to position herself away from what was coming. She had gone to Ashby's house and she was in that room, and whatever was being built on Fleet Street was being built with her inside it. He had been going to marry her in 3 months. He had stood in his east study and let himself believe that ambition and utility were sufficient foundations, that a man could build something real on a surface that thin. And she had been calculating the entire time, and the calculation had always run through Ashby, and he had been inside a conspiracy that included his own engagement. His hand closed on the letter. Thomas was watching him. Carew was watching him. "How many men do you trust?" Adrian said to Carew, not looking at him, looking at the letter. "In London?" 6. "Maybe 8. I need them tonight." "You have them." Adrian looked up. The January afternoon was running out of light. London was 4 hours. The wall on Fleet Street had been building since this morning, and Vivian was inside it, and Vane was inside it, and Ashby was inside it, with 6 years of preparation and a legal team and whatever piece of Serena's truth they'd managed to identify, and were currently working to discredit. He had Carew's statement. He had Hadfield's statement. He had the documents in the oilcloth and the secondary copies in a location no one could reach. He had Marcus Hale in London and the 3 newspapers in 6 hours. He had Serena's work. The only question that remained, in the gray last light of a January afternoon with everything on the line and no safe moves left in any direction, was whether he was finally the man she had always believed he could be. He put the letter in his coat, next to the journal. "Ride," he said. They rode into London at 9:30. The city at that hour had a particular quality of noise. Not the daytime noise of commerce and movement, but the nighttime noise of things continuing despite the dark, the carriages and the lamplight, and the low, persistent hum of a city that did not fully stop for anything. Adrian had ridden into London at night 100 times. It had never felt like this, like riding towards something that would either hold or break, with no middle ground available. Hale was waiting at the address Adrian had sent ahead, a townhouse off Piccadilly belonging to a man named Forsyth, a retired judge of impeccable reputation and no connection to any of the parties involved, who owed Adrian a significant favor from 7 years ago, and who had agreed on the strength of one brief message to open his house for the night. Hale met them at the door with the expression of a man who has been managing a complicated situation for several hours and is very glad to hand part of it to someone else. "Price folded," Hale said, before Adrian was fully through the door. "Took longer than I wanted. He has a statement, but he wants protections before he signs anything formal." "He'll get them," Adrian said. "Carew's statement?" "Your man Thomas rode ahead. Forsyth has it." Hale looked at Carew, who had ridden 4 hours without complaint, and looked it. "Lord Carew." "Hale," Carew said. "The newspapers," Adrian said. "Marston from the Chronicle is in the study. I couldn't reach Fellows at the Gazette tonight. He's out of the city, but his deputy is coming. The third paper is tricky. Whitmore won't move without seeing the documentation himself, and he won't come to a private house. He wants a neutral location. Tell him the Reform Club, midnight." Hale looked at him. "You're a member." So is Whitmore. Tell him I'll be there. And Ashby's side. They've been filing since early evening. Whatever they put before the courts tonight, it's designed to move fast. There may be an injunction by morning that— There won't be, Adrian said, if the story is already in print. Hale was quiet for a moment, then nodded. All right. Adrian turned to Carew. You need to eat something. Then you're going to sit with Marston and tell him what you told me. Everything. Don't curate it. Carew looked at him with the steady tiredness of a man who has made his decision and is now simply executing it. I said I'd speak for myself, he said. I'll speak for myself. Mebmed. The next 3 hours were the kind that compressed time. Not fast, not slow, but dense. Each minute carrying the weight of several. Adrian moved between rooms, between conversations, between the journalist in the study and the retired judge in the sitting room, and the various men Carew had produced who were now, with quiet efficiency, making themselves useful in ways that Adrian was choosing not to examine too closely. He sat with Marston for 40 minutes and laid out the documentation in the order Serena had organized it, which was the order that built the clearest narrative. Not dramatic, but logical. Each piece connecting to the next with the clean economy of someone who had understood that truth was most powerful when it didn't need embellishment. Marston was 60, experienced, the kind of journalist who had been in enough rooms with enough documents to know the real thing from the constructed thing at a glance. He read in silence. He asked 6 questions. He went to write. Adrian left for the Reform Club at 1:45. The city was quieter now. He rode with Thomas and one of Carew's men, and in the carriage he allowed himself, for the first time since Harwick, to open the space in his chest where he had been storing things and simply sit with the contents. Not process them. There was no processing available on this scale in this time frame, but acknowledge them. His father, murdered. Hadfield, compromised for 11 years. Vivian, inside the room with Ashby. Serena, who had given Clara Avery the waterproofed oilcloth and made her repeat the address, and then turned back toward the deck. The last one he held the longest. He had been thinking about her in operational terms for 2 days, as the source of the documentation, as the architect of the strategy he was executing, as the name he would put on the charitable institutions, the gesture toward legacy. All of that was true, and all of it was insufficient, and he knew it was insufficient, and he was beginning to understand that knowing it was insufficient was itself a form of change. The man he had been would have organized the grief efficiently and moved on. This man was sitting in a carriage at midnight with the grief unorganized and undissolved and present, and he was not moving away from it. He did not know yet how to live with it. He knew he was going to have to learn. Whitmore was already at the club when Adrian arrived. He was 55, thin, with the skeptical eyes of a man whose career had been built on the assumption that everyone in front of him had a version they preferred, and his job was to find the version underneath it. He looked at Adrian across the small table in the members' reading room, empty at this hour except for the 2 of them, and he said nothing, which was itself a kind of question. Adrian placed the oilcloth packet on the table. "Read," he said. Whitmore read. It took 40 minutes. He turned pages with the slow, deliberate attention of a man who was not going to be hurried and who understood that being hurried was sometimes the point, and that refusing it was a kind of power. Adrian sat across from him and did not fill the silence, because filling silences was another of the things he had been letting go of, the habits of a man who managed rooms rather than sitting honestly inside them. When Whitmore finished, he looked up. "This woman," he said. "Vale. She compiled all of this." "Yes." "And she's dead." "Yes." "And no one knew what she was doing while she was doing it." "I didn't," Adrian said. "Other people may have had pieces of it. She kept the whole to herself." Whitmore looked at the documents for a moment. "Why?" Adrian thought about the last entry in the journal. "The only thing I regret is that I never told him directly what I thought of him. Because she understood that incomplete information deployed too early does more damage than good," he said. "And because she was protecting someone who hadn't asked to be protected and wouldn't have known how to receive it." Whitmore looked at him. "You. Me." Whitmore was quiet. He looked back at the documents. "This runs in tomorrow's edition," he said. "Front page, full documentation cited. I'll need the signed statements by 6 in the morning. You'll have them by 4. And Lord Carew, he's willing to be named. He is. And you understand what this does, not just to Ashby, to Vane, to the whole structure. This goes public, and it's not containable. Yes, Adrian said. That's the point. Whitmore gathered the documents and looked at him one more time. She should have been here for this, he said. It was the most direct thing anyone had said to him in 2 days, and it hit him accordingly. Clean and hard, the way direct things do when you've been operating in the oblique for long enough that your defenses are calibrated for angles. Yes, Adrian said. She should have. Ashby's injunction reached Forsyth's house at 5 in the morning. It was, as legal documents go, impressive, dense, thorough, designed to create enough procedural complexity to delay any publication by weeks. It named Adrian specifically. It challenged the provenance of the documentation. It contained language that had clearly been crafted by someone who knew exactly what documents existed and exactly where the vulnerabilities in their chain of custody might be argued to lie. It arrived 2 hours after the Chronicle's first edition went to press. One of Carew's men brought the rolled Chronicle to the study where Adrian had been working through the night, and set it on the desk, and said nothing because nothing needed to be said. Adrian unrolled it and looked at the front page and felt something that was not satisfaction. Satisfaction was too clean, too finished for what this was, but something in the same territory. A door closing. Not triumphantly, just closing. The story was thorough. Marston had written it with the controlled precision of a man who understood that the facts were sufficient and did not require him to perform outrage on their behalf. The names were all there. The financial structures, the Moreau history, the Creel arrangement, Carew's statement, cited directly, Hadfield's confession, cited. The years of constructed manipulation that had sat inside the Blackthorne household and operated in the dark while the household ran above it. Serena's name was in the 3rd paragraph. The primary documentation underlying these disclosures was compiled over a period of more than 2 years by Miss Serena Vale, a private individual whose meticulous and courageous investigation of these matters was conducted without institutional support, official sanction, or personal recognition. Miss Vale died in September of this year. The Chronicle acknowledges her work as the foundation upon which this account rests. Adrian read the paragraph twice. Then he set the paper down and looked at the window, where the first gray light of a London morning was beginning to come through, slow and cold and entirely indifferent to the specific weight of what the night had produced. What? Ashby was arrested on the 14th of February. Vane was located in Brussels 6 weeks after that, through channels that combined Adrian's political contacts with the kind of quiet international pressure that became available once the story was public and the legal case had sufficient momentum. He was returned to England in March. The process of his return was neither fast nor clean, but it was inexorable in the way that things become inexorable once the architecture supporting them has been fully exposed, and the people who built it are no longer in positions to maintain it. Price, in exchange for his cooperation and his signed statement, received a reduced consequence that he would spend the rest of his professional life grateful for and publicly silent about. Lords Ashby and the other, Carew had given him as Fenwick, and Fenwick proved, under the pressure of what was coming, to be far less sturdy than his years of alignment with Ashby had suggested, were removed from their political positions and faced proceedings that would occupy the next 2 years of their lives and resolve in ways that were not, by any measure, comfortable. Hadfield was disbarred. He lived out the remaining years of a diminished life in a smaller house, in a less remarked-upon part of the country, and if he thought about Serena Vale during those years, and Adrian suspected, without certainty, that he did, he kept those thoughts to himself. Vivian. Vivian was the one he had least clarity on, even now. She came to Blackthorne Hall in March, 3 weeks after the engagements collapsed. The word plural because the news about Ashby had made her position in society untenable in ways that had cascaded through every connection she'd built on the back of the Blackthorne name. She came alone, as Serena had come alone, and Adrian received her in the East Study, standing this time because some things you learned and kept. She was still beautiful in the composed, architectural way she had always been beautiful. She sat in the chair across from his desk, and she looked at him with the eyes of a woman who has made her calculations and found them wanting and is in the process of deciding what version of herself to be on the other side of that discovery. "I didn't know about your father," she said. "I want you to know that. I knew Ashby had interests in how your affairs developed. I didn't know the extent of it." "What did you know?" he said. She was quiet for a moment. "That Ashby was useful to us, to my family, that his support of the engagement was not incidental, that there were things he expected to benefit from in various ways once the marriage was established." She met his eyes. "I told myself it was the way these things worked, that everyone in our position had interests they were managing, and this was simply mine." "And Serena?" Something moved through her face. "Serena and I have never been. We are very different people. She always saw things I didn't want seen." She paused. "I didn't know she was in danger. Whatever you believe about me, I didn't know that." He looked at her for a long moment. She was telling the partial truth, which was the most she was capable of in this room, which was perhaps the most she was capable of in any room. He had chosen her. He had looked at her calculation and called it intelligence and called it pragmatism and told himself it was enough. That was his failure, not hers. She had been exactly what she'd always been. He had simply been too comfortable to look at what that was. "Go home, Vivienne," he said. Not unkindly. There was no anger left for her. The anger had gone to places that deserved it more. "Build something that's actually yours." She stood. She looked at him with an expression he couldn't fully name. Not regret, not quite, but something adjacent to it. Something that recognized, without being able to fully articulate it, what she had been part of and what it had cost. She left. He didn't watch her go. He went to Bath in April. The solicitor Ferrars, who had held Serena's letters and fulfilled his instruction faithfully, was a quiet man in his 60s with an office above a bookshop. He received Adrian with the careful courtesy of someone who understands he has been party to a significant thing without knowing its full dimensions, and he had one additional item that had not been included in the original bundle. A second, smaller envelope, addressed in Serena's hand, sealed, with a note on the outside in her writing that said, "Only if it's over, only if you finished it." Adrian sat in Ferrar's outer office and held it for some time before he opened it. Inside was a single sheet. It was not dated. It was the one piece of her correspondence that had no dates, no documentation, no citations. Just her handwriting, in the same small, precise script, and the words, "I know you well enough to know you'll want to do something formal. A memorial or an institution or a name on a building. Don't spend too much time on that. Spend the time on whatever it is you've been avoiding being. I waited 4 years for you to become it without prompting, and I ran out of time, which was my fault as much as yours. Don't let it be the only story. S." He sat with it in Ferrar's outer office for a long time. Then he put it in his coat next to the journal, and he thanked Ferrars and walked out into the April morning. The institution was established in June. He named it plainly, the Vale Foundation. Nothing elaborate, nothing that would make the name carry more weight than the work. Its purpose was the support of individuals engaged in the kind of patient, unglamorous, unrecognized work that Serena had done. Research, documentation, the careful assembly of truth in conditions that didn't reward it. He endowed it substantially. He put people he trusted in charge of it and gave them the latitude to do it properly. And stayed out of the governance, because he had learned late and thoroughly that his instinct to manage was sometimes useful and sometimes the thing that most needed to be resisted. Carew's son James, the one who hadn't spoken to his father in 11 years, wrote to Adrian in July. The letter was brief and did not excuse anything or require anything. It said that he had read what had been reported about the origins of his father's actions, and that he was not interested in rehabilitation and was not prepared to forgive, but that he had wanted Adrian to know that someone had been aware of what happened to him and had considered it worth including in the account of what drove a man to do what Carew had done. The letter said, "I don't know if that changes anything. I don't think it does. But it was the first time anyone has ever written it down, and I found that mattered more than I expected. Adrian read the letter 3 times and wrote back once, briefly, and said that he understood. He didn't entirely understand. He was in the process of understanding. That was different, and he had stopped pretending the difference didn't matter. The East Study was the same room. He had not changed it, had not moved the desk or reordered the shelves, or replaced the Persian rug with its amber tones that looked, in certain light, like old blood. He had thought about it and decided against it, because changing the room would have been a way of managing the discomfort of the room, and he was done managing discomfort. He was learning to sit in it, which was slower and less efficient, and he was beginning to believe the only honest way through. He sat at the desk on an October evening, almost exactly a year since the night Pemberton had brought him Hadfield's news in this room, and he worked through correspondence that was now, finally, the kind of correspondence a man worked through when the immediate fires were out and the longer, slower work had begun. The foundation, the northern land arrangements, restructured, the household accounts, managed now by a woman named Morrow, who had been recommended by Marcus Hale and who had, in 3 months, demonstrated a quality of systematic attention that Adrian recognized and was careful this time not to take for granted. He stopped working at some point and sat in the quiet room with the lamp and the fire and the October wind in the old elms, and he thought about the specific silence of the room as it had been on the March afternoon when Serena walked out of it. He had heard, in that silence, something he had not been able to name at the time. He could name it now. It was the sound of a man who had been held together by someone else's invisible labor finally being left to hold himself together, and the discovery that he did not yet know how. He was still learning how. He thought he would be learning for some time. He thought that was probably correct, that the learning was not a passage you moved through and emerged from, changed, and finished, but a practice, like the practice of sitting with discomfort instead of managing it, like the practice of looking rather than glancing, something you did every day with the full knowledge that yesterday's doing did not exempt you from today's. He picked up the journal. He opened it to the last entry, which he had read many times now, often enough that the pages fell open there without direction. He read, "The only thing I regret is that I never told him directly what I thought of him." He had thought about what that sentence meant for months. He had turned it in his hands like a stone, examining each face, testing the weight. He had come to believe that what she had not told him was not an insult and not a condemnation, but something closer to what the last letter in the secondary envelope had contained: an honest account, an accurate assessment of a man who was capable of something he had not yet become, which was the most demanding thing one person could believe about another, because it required the believed in to actually become it, or live indefinitely in the gap between who they were and who someone saw them as capable of being. She had lived in that gap for 4 years. He intended to spend the rest of his life closing it. Not for her, or not only. The for her portion of it was real, and would remain real, and did not need to be resolved into something cleaner, because clean was another form of management, and he was done with that. For her and for himself, and for the 17-year-old who had watched from the northern provinces, and the 23-year-old who had made one mistake in the wrong room, and all the people who moved through the long shadow of a man too comfortable to look at what his comfort cost. He closed the journal. He set it on the desk next to the lamp, in the place where he had taken to keeping it, not hidden, not displayed, just present, the way things that matter should be present, available, visible, part of the ordinary surface of a life being lived with more care than before. Outside, the old elms moved in the October wind. He picked up his pen and went back to work. The room was quiet around him, and the quiet was not empty, and he was not, in any sense that counted, alone in it. That would have to be enough. He had decided, some months ago, that it was.